Hello there. Thanks so much for joining us. And of course, you know who I am. I'm Joanna MacGregor from the Brighton Philharmonic. I'm joined today by Jonathan Cross, who's a great old pal who's going to help us talk and discuss the amazing Stravinsky, the Rite of Spring, which of course the orchestra is playing on September the 22nd. So, Jonathan, it's so great to have you here. I know you as a great Birtwistle expert, apart from anything.
Well, actually, there's a painting of Birtwistle by his son on the wall behind me, so that's a very timely comment.
And of course, Stravinsky was one of his all-time top composers, I
Well, he
suppose.
was, and that was one of the ways, in fact, that I got into Stravinsky's music. It sounds backwards, but was through a teenage obsession with Birtwistle, and hearing so much of Stravinsky, including a work like The Rite of Spring in his music, which led me to explore all sorts of things. And we haven't got time to talk about it today, but the way in which Stravinsky's music and the Rite of Spring in particular just echoes down the 20th and still into the 21st century.
I can't agree more. I wrote a tiny bit about this in the Friends newsletter just
Mm.
last week because obviously most composers can't escape the shadow of Stravinsky, like they can't escape the shadow of Bach somehow. And Stravinsky, in particular, Rite of Spring, obviously has permeated a lot of 20th and 21st century scores, not least because of this fantastic orchestration. But shall we talk a little bit about this very famous premiere first, which of course everybody knows about the riots that happened?
Well, certainly. I mean, everybody knows about the riot. The question is, did it really happen? And nobody's entirely sure. The problem with the stories about that famous first night, which was the 29th of May, 1913, in the Théâtre Champs-Élysées, brand new theatre, had only been open about 3 weeks in Paris. Clearly something happened. There was a bit of a disturbance. But then over the decades, more and more stories have been added to it. And Stravinsky himself was guilty of that. I mean, Stravinsky always had, how shall I say, a tangential relationship with the truth. It served his own purposes to sort of create the myth about this piece. I mean, there were stories about, fights going on and shouting and the performance having to, nobody could hear what was going on. Maybe it was true. The police were called. There's a scholar who tried to look into this, and it's fascinating that in the prefecture, Paris prefecture of police, the records for that particular week have gone missing. So
Oh.
somebody's taken
Oh.
them. So we don't actually know whether
Well,
it's true.
maybe
Clearly,
yeah.
something happened. I think the point is this piece was so different from everything
Yeah.
else.
Well, different from the first half of the concert, even,
Exactly.
where they sort of rather, in a way, rather craftily put on the most conventional Les
Mm.
Sylphides of ballets in the hope to get everybody in, and then, of course, hit them between the eyes with this, which
Yeah.
I think probably was a bit of a shock for
Well,
the.
it was, and in a way, I mean, after that first performance, Diaghilev, we might talk a bit more about him. He was the sort of the master puppeteer, the impresario of the Ballet Russe company that put it on. His famous phrase was, exactly what I wanted. In other words, he wanted a scandal, to bring attention to the company, to bring attention to the work. And in fact, the subsequent performances, there weren't that many of them in Paris and then a few weeks later in London, passed without incidents. It was really that first night where he papered the house and he'd got the bright young things and the traditional old things. And of course, there was going to be
Yeah.
fireworks, but it got the attention. So there you
It's
go.
very good publicity. I'm sure you know the film The Red Shoes very well, which seems to have a Diaghilev figure all the
Mm.
way through, who's very manipulative of the
Yeah.
composer, and in this case, the lead ballerina. And the big score they dance to is so influenced by Stravinsky. Obviously,
Yeah.
it's all about the ballet russe and the idea that you could write something really very controversial and almost magical, because I suppose the powerful thing about the Rite of Spring, and we feel it even more, is this idea of ritual and the irrational almost coming
Yeah.
out of the earth.
Yeah.
And that's what people really grapple with when they hear it now. It's still quite scary.
Absolutely. I mean, so that's one aspect of it. It's the idea of the emergence of spring, the cracking of the ice after the long, cold Russian winter, nature coming back to life again. So there's something very primeval about it. That's certainly one aspect. But another thing that I think we forget is that it's kind of rooted in a Russian past. And the two ballet scores that Stravinsky produced before the Rite of Spring in collaboration with Diaghilev reveal that very clearly. The first was the Firebird, Stravinsky's first great success in Paris in 1910. In fact, he was a latecomer to that. Other composers had dropped out and he came at the last minute. that, is essentially a 19th century Russian world of fairy tale. The music sounds like Stravinsky's teacher, Rimsky-Korsakov. Then we get Petrushka a year later, which shows a very, very different musical style, much more modernist. And then, of course, the Rite of Spring burst onto the scene, which is not just this primeval thing, but also, really grappling with what we would call a modernist musical language, with new kinds of harmony, where rhythm comes to the fore. And I think that's what really kind of knocks you out of your seat when you hear this piece.
It's interesting. I mean, obviously, you still hear bits of Firebird and definitely Petrushka in the Rite of Spring. Right, halfway through the second movement, it suddenly turns into Petrushka rather gloriously, all in C major and sort of dancing and everything. And it's a wonderful sort of assimilation of all his styles and Russian folk music, which I know quite a lot of research has been done. He always said there was no kind of folk music in Rite of Spring, and now people tend to think they can hear something a bit more specific.
Well, actually, he said, but he said there was one folk tune only, which was the very opening, the very famous high opening for bassoon, which is a Lithuanian melody, and that's quite clear. Then nothing else. But in fact, after his death, all the sketch material became available, and scholars started to look at it, and it was quite clear that folk music is everywhere in this piece. It's hidden. It's not literally on the surface. It's transformed. But nonetheless, he was taking these out of folk music sources. It wasn't just Russian, but Ukrainian and Lithuanian and other kinds of material. But it's so absorbed into the music that if you don't know it's there, you don't necessarily hear it. But I think it still infuses the spirit of the piece.
I think that's right. And I think Stravinsky all throughout his life, I mean, he seemed to have two huge influences. One is the folk music of his Russian background, and then, of course, the Russian Orthodox Church, which became much more prevalent in his music. You could hear it as he became a bit more austere.
Yeah.
Well, do you think it cast a very long shadow on his career? There's that thing where composers write almost one very famous piece in their lives, and they can almost not escape it. And Stravinsky seemed to be okay about embracing that. I mean, obviously, he wrote many, many masterpieces after the Rite of Spring, but he almost enjoyed going back. He made 3 different recordings, I think, of this piece.
Yeah.
I mean, and he was willing to speak about it quite a bit. He would go and watch other conductors do it, because obviously orchestras, in fact, learned to play it. It was sort of seemed unplayable initially. What do you think?
Well, it was. I mean, it was right at the edge of what was possible in 1913. And that last week, my local youth orchestra were playing it. So it shows how how things have changed. Yeah, I mean, clearly this work was very important for him. I don't think it did actually overshadow the rest of his career, because I mean, I often like to think of Stravinsky as rather like Picasso. Again, Picasso kind of really launched himself in the world with those early Cubist works, and then went on and did all kinds of other things. And in Stravinsky's career, in many ways, followed similar lines. He turned his back on it and moved in very different directions, following very much the trends of the time. In a sense, after the First World War, you could never have gone back to that. The violence of the Rite of Spring, with this ritual murder of the young girl at the end, seems, in hindsight, almost prophetic. The horror of the First World War. You couldn't do that again. So he moved on. But I think the other important thing to remember is that we now know this piece. It's everywhere, particularly in its concert performances, perhaps less so than as a ballet. But actually, in the early days, it wasn't heard very much. There were just these handful of first performances in Paris, and then it was dropped. It was revived in 1920. The first proper published score didn't appear until 21, 22. They were working from hand copies, autograph, which I have here. Interesting. I've got a facsimile of it here, massive thing. But what is really interesting, you can
marvelous.
see it there. But this was used as a performance score. You won't be able to see it there, but lots of colored pencils on, many different conductors using that score to perform from.
Well, this
only a handful of them circulating, so it wasn't
what happens now, of course, with contemporary music. I mean, how many of us, including myself, have done first performances from handwritten scores? Nothing gets published. I know it's slightly changed with Sibelius software now, but all of us have got these handwritten scores where you first And of course, it's much harder to work from handwritten scores somehow, but it tells you a lot. You know,
It
you
does,
pick
and we're
up so
losing that
much.
the orthography, the
Yeah.
style of handwriting in itself can tell you something about
Oh,
the
absolutely. It tells you the
style.
speed that's intended. It tells you the
Mm.
fury with which sometimes these things are written down, and then the lovely scribblings and overlay of everything.
Mm.
So as we're having a bit
Actually,
of
I was just going to say that one of the crucial moments in this story is actually thanks to Disney. It was when the Rite of Spring was used in Fantasia in 1940 that suddenly a much larger audience became aware of this piece. And of course, with the growth of the recording industry as well, people could access it. Up to that point, you know, it was known more about as a myth than it was as a musical reality. And of course, now it's
yes.
everywhere. We can access it at the touch of a button.
It's actually I was looking at Fantasia the other day because I hadn't seen it for quite some years, and it's still really good, that part of the film where they do a
It
large
is.
amount of the Rite of Spring. It's fantastically well.
But
And
it's also mucked about. I mean, it's all in a different order from the Rite of Spring itself. And Stravinsky was very upset by it because he signed the rights away for a relatively small amount of money. I forget how much it was, thinking that the film was going to be a flop. And of course, the film was a great success. And if he'd actually retained the rights, he could have earned an awful lot more out of that thing. And he was very
it,
upset about the way his music had been chopped up. And
oh,
he
I don't know. I'm sure secretly he was quite pleased at the
well, of
popularity of
course,
it, and
yeah.
and he was actually a tough businessman, Stravinsky. You know, he loved making money, which is why he kept on reprinting things to extend the copyright of everything. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah, yeah.
and why not? Well, as you've held up your wonderful facsimile, I'm going to hold up my conducting score, which is this size, which I'm working on at the moment. And of course, like your facsimile, it's covered in different colours as I try and extrapolate who I need to cue at any one point. I suppose we ought to talk about the size of the orchestra and the incredible
Yeah.
orchestration in this piece. And it's very large, even by today's standards. It's a large orchestra, you know, with a lot of horns, brass, quadruple woodwind, lots of contrabassoons, that kind
Yeah,
of thing.
yeah.
It still is a furiously impressive thing to look at. I mean, do you think that in itself, I mean, I know Rimsky-Korsakov was writing very big scores at the time, you know, influencing Stravinsky. What do you think about the orchestration in itself?
Yeah, it is fascinating. Yes, it's a big orchestra. And I think what interests me is the different ways in which it's used. So there are clearly moments where, I mean, most famously, I suppose, at the very end with the sacrificial dance, where you get huge blocks of sound, where virtually all the instruments are playing together. But there are other moments almost of chamber music where you get these very simple lines coming through or lines that change color. So actually having, three flutes and a piccolo, lots of different size clarinets, bass clarinet, and so on. It gives him the possibility of all these very subtle variations of color, which he uses extraordinarily effectively across the entirety of the piece. So it's not just one thing. Of course, when the whole orchestra is going full pelt, it's enormously exciting, but that's not all it does. Yeah.
No, not at all. It's got the most incredible color, particularly at the beginning of part two, which I think is
Mm.
miraculous orchestration and very translucent and seems to sort of give a lineage of French music from Ravel into Messiaen. It was absolutely extraordinarily
Yeah.
subtle and
Yeah.
beautiful music. But I suppose when you're young and you see it for the first time, as I did, you just remember the rhythm of the thing, you know, and the pounding rhythms and these very shocking sort of as you say, the vertical orchestration where everybody is playing at the same time. And then as you get older, you begin to hear the softer bits or the or
Yeah.
the more
Yeah.
subtle colours around it.
But in a way, the opening itself, the introduction, I think is really kind of instructive in that point of view, because it starts with this single line with this famous high bassoon solo, which I guess was much higher in 1913 than it is today, a different kind of instrument. It was more of a struggle for the play. You get that kind of tension there. And slowly, one by one, the different instruments appear. It's almost like, nature coming back to life after this long dormant winter. Each has what we would call an ostinato, little repeating patterns that go round and round. And so he builds this texture up bit by bit by bit until eventually the whole orchestra is playing. It's kind of overwhelming. And then it just cuts off. and you're just left again with that bassoon solo at the very end before we move into the next
very
section.
famous chord.
And we get to the second section with the famous.
Very proud of this fantastic chord and the rhythm that he. Yes, it's a visual thing as well, because I remember being very young and seeing Pierre Boulez conduct this, and I was obviously sitting at the back of the hall, being very young and not very rich, and you can see visually everybody coming in, and then you see the entire orchestra building. I mean, it's a fantastic thing to watch.
There is, and there was this wonderful performance last year at the Proms that Aurora did, where they did the Rite of Spring from memory, in itself quite a feat. But what was so striking about that these musicians, without music stands in the way, you know, that you could see them engaging with one another, and the almost the drama of the music, even without the ballet, the drama of the music as these groups of sounds moved around the platform was really very striking. Yeah.
I think we'll all be feeling that drama when we with or without the music. It's all pretty dramatic. Let's just finish by talking about all the different conductors that have engaged with this piece, because there are many famous performances. You know, we mentioned that obviously Stravinsky recorded it, I think, in 1929, his first.
It was one of the first things he did. I mean, with that new recording technology, he wanted to be the first to get it out there. There was a race to be the first to produce this piece. You're right. Over his life, he did. And what's very interesting, you know, at one point he said something like, you know, my music is not about interpretation, it's about execution. Brackets, not in the firing squad sense, he said, ha ha ha. But in other words, you just play what I wrote. But in fact, if you hear those three recordings, the tempi are very different. He wasn't actually following his own instructions.
Yeah, they are very different, but he does put very specific metronome marks all the way through the score, and actually they're very good metronome marks. They really make sense, and they get you from one movement to the next movement quite comfortably, because there are connections in some places. And I'm very intrigued, obviously preparing it myself to conduct, at watching how precise or not conductors are. So I grew up with Boulez, who I absolutely worship as a conductor. His technique is fantastic, and the way he keeps very cool about the whole thing and just coolly make.
And when you listen to the Boulez recordings of this piece, you know, it is that rhythmic precision, absolutely analytical, the way that he does it. I mean, you can see, you know, his manner of conducting when you listen to those recordings. Absolutely fantastic. Precise, and modernist in that sense.
Yes, and also guiding everybody, you know, and then of course you get some younger conductors, or even somebody like Bernstein, who's rather extraordinary to watch. You wonder how they're following anything at all, but somehow it's getting the results that he needs. So,
that Bernstein recording, and then there's one he'd made with the Israel Philharmonic, which I think is absolutely extraordinary. I mean, it is sort of more glitzy than anything, you know, that Disney would ever heard of, and he brings that out of the music. You know, you don't get that in Boulez. And there are others, I mean, conductors that I admire, like Esa-Pekka Salonen, you know, sort of the composer's approach to, I mean, like Boulez to this music. You kind of really feel that he's internalized that music and is sort of at one with the musicians that he's working with. I mean, I guess, you know, a question from me to you in a way, really, with this, because, you know, we're not 1913 now. This is music that is known. So in a sense, you know, the players coming to this are not coming to this piece for the first time. So in a sense, you've got something as a conductor to work with and shape in a way that the first performances didn't. Would you agree? Or?
Yes, I think it's still pretty hard. Actually, I'm
not denying that it's not difficult.
I don't think the players would ever underestimate how tricky some of these rhythms are. We all know that very last movement is quite nasty, and then there's another movement
where the trickles down.
Yeah, the clarinet.
And then you've got to come in with a like
yeah, and different conductors do it in different ways, dividing the threes and the twos and everything. And it's quite a puzzle how you're going to do it. And there are a couple of other things. So I think all of us are very much on our mettle there. But you're right, it's become a classic piece. And like all masterworks, you can shape them and look for things, look for different colors in them, look for your favorite parts in them. You know, the orchestration is so clever and so glamorous. There's always something you can pull out and make very beautiful.
How far do you think that its origins as a ballet score are important when you're performing it as a concert piece? because it's so much more frequently done as a concert piece these days than it is as a ballet. There's some very exciting choreographies to it. Do you think you need to take that into account when you're preparing the concert performance of it?
I think it's inherent in the music, isn't it? I mean, didn't Stravinsky say that the one thing that really mattered in music was dance? And I think he was talking about Bach at the time, but he said all great music has got dance rhythm in it.
Mm.
And I don't think he was referring to his ballet music. I think he was talking about all music has got a dance rhythm of some kind, which is quite interesting. I think it gets back to the idea of folk music and the sources of music, why we have music in the first place. So
there's a
we
lovely
have to do
inscription in the
there.
sketches. He writes in Russian something along the lines of, there is music wherever there is a rhythm, and there is life where there's ever a pulse. So for him, actually, that kind of rhythmic dance origin of all music was crucial to the way that he thought.
Yeah, I mean it's crucial in his chamber music. You hear it even in his piano sonata, which is a relatively unknown piece of his, but that's both neoclassical but also full of dance rhythm. So I always think about this to do with Stravinsky, as well as this folk background that we've talked about. I mean, I'm a big fan of Pina Bausch's choreography to his.
So am I. I think it's the best, actually. I mean, in many ways.
It's sort of absolutely devastatingly fantastic. And if anybody hasn't seen it, you can find it on YouTube. I saw it quite recently, actually. I have seen it live a couple of times, which is a shattering experience.
Yeah,
In some ways, because of her choreography, you recover the shock of this piece in a way. It's just so dynamic.
It's a nasty piece, actually. I mean, if you sit back and think about what it's actually saying, this kind of ritual murder of a young girl,
Yes, well,
it's almost as if we as an audience are somehow complicit in that, that the music is so overwhelming and so powerful that we become, complicit in her murder at the end, this ritual.
Yes, I suppose it's become a ritualistic allegory of some kind, because as you said, it came just before the cataclysm of the First World War, where everybody sensed something was going to go wrong, something terrible was going to happen. And you can sort of hear this in retrospect in the music. And also this idea of ritual is very important to certain composers, which gets us back to where we started. Harrison Birtwistle, another composer who said the problem with modern life is there's no ritual anymore, and was constantly trying to imbue his own music with ritual. And I suppose that's the one big thing. It's there in the title, and it's there in a lot of Stravinsky's other music.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. And I think, if you read textbooks about Stravinsky, there's sort of dividing up his life into these different, or his creative life into these different periods that were doing different things. I don't really see it like that anymore. Yeah, on the surface, it's a bit like Picasso we were talking about earlier. There are these surface changes, but beneath it, I think this desire for ritual, which in musical terms comes through certain kinds of repetitions, certain sorts of structures, whether there's drama, explicit drama or not, I think goes right through to his very last works. If you listen to a piece like the Requiem Canticles, there's so much in there, the ritual ringing of bells at the end, which you can hear already in the Rite of Spring, or indeed even in earlier works. And it's very hard to put words to why that is so powerful. But I think Birtwistle was right. We have that need for a certain kind of ritual in our lives, and a piece like the Rite of Spring puts us back into touch with that.
Really agree with that. And I think that's why people are drawn to composers like Arvo Pärt, who's obviously a lot to do with ritual, perhaps in a more obvious way to do with his religion, but and James Macmillan as well. I mean, I think we're all drawn to ritual because we miss it in our everyday life somehow.
Yeah, no, absolutely right.
But anyway, this is fantastic. Thank you so much. You've said so many.
It's been a great pleasure, and I'm really looking forward to the performance. Good luck with the preparations. I'm sure.
Thank you so much. I think we'll have a wonderful time rehearsing it and playing it. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Joe.
Bye.